Hello and welcome. I'm Elise Labott, and you may remember me from my role as CNN Global Affairs correspondent, but now I've started a new venture called Zivvy Media, which is a media platform to engage young people on the global issues that everyone is examining here at the council, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, in which we're going to be talking about today. I want to give a special thanks to our members for joining us on this program, reflecting on this past year of disruption and what it revealed about the changing geopolitical order and lessons that 2021 can teach policymakers. Now, before we get started, as means of a disclaimer, remember that the Council is an independent and nonpartisan organization and takes no institutional policy positions. So the views expressed by the participants today are their own. And if you have a question, we'll be taking questions in about 30 minutes or so via ccga.live. Just enter ccga.live in your browser, follow the on-screen prompts, and you'll be able to submit or vote for your favorite questions there. So any more further ado, I want to welcome two men who really need no introductions to this crowd. Ian Bremmer is the president and founder of the Eurasia Group and GZERO Media, and Ivo Daalder is the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Gentlemen, great to have you break all this down for us.
Hey, thanks, Elise, and thanks for doing this. Ian, great to see you. We started off, I think, the year talking about global affairs, and we're ending it. We got to get a life.
Yeah.
Global affairs can be fun. So I'd love to start off on reflections on the last year. Obviously, COVID dominated everyone's attention, and we'll get to that. But I want to see what in your mind were some of the developments over the past year that were most impactful. Ian, let's start with you.
Well, I mean, I would say three things probably that really stick with me. COVID is number one, the fact that we've learned literally no lessons over the last 2 years. And so we're ending the year with a lot of the same trepidation and exhaustion that we started it. Secondly, climate, where frankly, it is so nice to see that 194 countries around the world all agree on basic science, that 1.1 degrees of global warming as a consequence of humanity intervening on the planet. So it's not all disinformation and all politics out there. And that basic understanding, plus young people increasingly angry about it, has helped to create some momentum. And the COP26 was a more significantly positive meeting than many people would have expected, especially in this pandemic. And then finally, of course, the events of January 6th, which as an American who cut his teeth with the end of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, when democracy was winning and the Americans were driving that, we're not driving any winning democracy today. And of course, that's unfortunate to experience as someone who cares about this country.
We're going to get to all of that in the next 45 minutes. Ivo, anything to add to that list? I mean, it was a big year.
It was a good list, but I'd add two things. First, Afghanistan, and not the decision to withdraw or even the horrific way in which we withdrew, even though we did get 124,000 people out. Now, the fact that 20 years, $3 trillion of investment, 50 countries sending troops and money, the entire international community spending its time there, we're back exactly at the same place that we were, frankly, on the 10th of October, the 7th of October, 2001, when U.S. forces started the war against Afghanistan, with the Taliban in power, the very folks, the very people, same people and same ministries after 20 years of fighting. What a failure of policy and I think deep sort of consequences. And the other is I think we are as close to a major military confrontation with Russia, whether not directly with the U.S., but with Russian military forces moving in Europe again, as we have been in 30 years. And that even accepts the reality that, of course, the Russians invaded Ukraine in 2014. What's happening near Ukraine and around Ukraine, and what's happening in Moscow, and the rhetoric that we're seeing is extremely worrisome. And I think the first 2 months of this year, we're going to see things either quickly moving in a really bad way, which is what I fear, or some way to get out of it. But we'll talk about how to do that. But those are two things: the prospect of a major conflict in Europe and 20 years of investment that led to failure on the part of the United States and its allies, but really on the part of the United States.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously this is called lessons learned. So 2021. So I hope that policymakers are willing to kind of look back and learn some lessons that have been taught us by where we're and how we're leaving Afghanistan and the shape we're leaving it in now, which we'll also get to. But before we move on to some of those issues, Ivo, biggest surprise this year? What was the biggest shocker? It was a world of chaos, but a lot of times you say you can't make this stuff up.
Biggest surprise. I think where Ian started. We've been 2 years and spent billions and billions and billions of dollars of dealing with COVID. We actually have a pretty good sense of how to deal with it. Vaccinations, masking, testing on a regular basis. We actually could, given where the science has brought us with vaccinations and treatments, which hopefully the FDA will approve in the next few days even, we could be beating this thing, certainly in the Northern Hemisphere, certainly among the rich countries. And we're just not. I mean, Ian is in New York City. What did you get today? 28,000 cases. I'm in Chicago, where we broke the record in the pandemic by 6,000 just last year, in the last day, in terms of cases. And it's just remarkable that it's surprising that a president and an administration that got in many ways elected to deal with this issue, for some reason hasn't been able to do so.
Yeah. Ian, was that the biggest shocker for you, or was there anything that kind of, at GZERO, you're kind of, every day looking at, the biggest developments in global affairs? What was the one that really had you kind of shaking your head?
Look, I mean, shaking my head, we've already talked about it. Shaking my head about the failures in execution in Afghanistan, shaking my head about the failures, AUKUS and France, shaking my head about the way we aren't handling vaccine development, distribution in the US. But none of those things are surprising. They're just sad. Yeah. Shaking your head in despondent recognition. Yeah. But two things that honest to God surprised me. One, that the Chinese, who were they came out of the gate like a shot last year. They were the only G20 economy that grew. And they looked like they were going to lead the world in vaccine diplomacy. And this year really failed. Their vaccines really don't work. As a consequence, and they've had all these supply chain challenges, and zero COVID policy has not served them very well domestically. And so I think China's had a really bad year, actually. And so that's a little surprising given where they were last year. Another surprise, interesting, is that Angela Merkel, who many would have considered to be the leader of the free world, and certainly Europe's strongest leader for some decade and a half, was incapable of getting the people that she wanted as her successor elected. Instead, the Germans chose the person that they thought was most like Merkel, but not the person that Merkel wanted. And I think that's interesting. It's not all that important, but it is surprising. Yeah. It is surprising. So two little surprises.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I thought that the January 6th insurrection was really the most surprising. I mean, not that there was so much anger or, that there was so much disinformation and conspiracy theories and, fraudulent claims of election fraud, but that people would really think that they would be able to run the Capitol, seize a coup here in the United States. And we're going to talk more about, the backslide of democracy here in the United States. But for me, that was the biggest shocker. Let's move on to some geopolitical issues. Let's start with Taiwan. Relations between Taipei and Beijing are at their lowest point in decades. And, Beijing is stepping up pressure on other countries to downgrade ties with Taiwan, but you also see this increasing number of military missions. Everyone's talking about what would the US do if China made a major military move against Taiwan. And this is really ramping up tensions between the US. I think that President Biden has said that, they're not looking for Taiwan to encouraging independence, but I think there've been some moves that have been seen as certainly provocative by the Chinese, whether it's, and I'm not saying that these were wrong, but I could see where the Chinese would think that they're provocative, whether it's congressmen on the island or Taiwan was recently invited to the Democracy Summit. Ian, how dire is the situation now? Where is Beijing? And looking ahead towards the next year, is this going to be a major flashpoint?
I think relations with China were somewhat worse at the end of the Trump administration than they are right now. Not a lot, but somewhat worse. Biden understands that he lost votes on China by being seen as weak in the run-up to the 2020 election, so he is unwilling to cave or to be seen as such again. But privately, engagement with China has improved significantly in the past couple of months. Not just with the meeting, but also on climate, also with the coordination of the release of the strategic petroleum reserves. The Americans reached out to the Chinese, asked them to join, they did so. And there is the potential for us to take off some of the tariffs that Trump put on, in part because we have inflation at 40-year highs right now, and you could do something about that. Biden even waited a lot on the decision to put the diplomatic boycott on the Beijing Olympics. He was hoping that no one was going to go to Beijing, that they wouldn't be invited given where the pandemic was, and then he wouldn't have to do it. Let's keep in mind, not only is he not boycotting with the athletes, but he isn't even telling the corporates that they shouldn't sponsor. So, I do think that the private messaging between the US and China is somewhat more stable. I wouldn't say it's trusting, I wouldn't say it's friendly, but it's somewhat more stable than it was at the end of the Trump administration. And on Taiwan, I think the Biden administration has worked really hard to convince the Chinese that Taiwan is not Afghanistan, that Taiwan is not Ukraine, and that there would be very significant risks that would be run directly by China that could include military confrontation with the US and allies if they were to try to suddenly overturn the status quo. And I think that message has been received by China. So even there, which is an area of some conflict, I think some of the things that the Americans have done under the Biden administration has actually helped to reduce the risk of sudden escalation and crisis.
Yeah, but just a quick follow on that. Yes, there's messaging about that this could provoke military confrontation. Is that really a possibility? And that meeting, obviously, as you allude to, the virtual meeting between Xi Jinping and President Biden, I think she was pretty clear, we're not here to compromise on Taiwan, and there are red lines, and don't cross them.
Yeah. So to me or to Ivo?
Ivo, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with Ian on both of his big points. I do think that the administration has tried very, very hard, and to some extent more successfully than you would have thought, to counter the domestic political pressure to have a only be hawkish on China policy, and trying to figure out how, as Tony Blinken said at the very beginning, where can we cooperate? And they did it on climate, and they've done it on a couple of other things. Where do we need to compete? And that's really been defined in the domestic political terms, in terms of almost industrial policy, in the infrastructure policy, and then where do we need to confront? And I think on Taiwan, the message has been, we're okay with the status quo. We don't want to change the status quo. We're not walking away from the one China policy. We're not walking away from any of the agreements that we have with Beijing that we signed in the 70s and the 80s. But we also are very clear that solving this problem through military force, which is a problem, is totally unacceptable. And we're building up our capacity to do something about it. Ian mentioned AUKUS as one of the signals. The other was that the first two people who were asked to come to the White House were the president of South Korea and the prime minister of Japan. That the first meeting that the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State had abroad was to those two countries, and of course the strengthening of the Quad, first with a virtual and then an in-person meeting of the leaders back in September, all of which are to signal to the Chinese that there is a limit to your freedom to do whatever you want to do in the region, and particularly when it comes to the issue of the use of military force. There's no doubt in my mind that Beijing and the PLA are looking at this and saying, we're not ready yet. So I'm not actually worried about next year. All the signs are that the military buildup that the Chinese are engaged in will still take some more time. And that also means we have time to diffuse it. We have time for diplomacy. We have time for our own strengthening our own deterrent measures. And I think it is, signaling that this is serious, that it is different from Afghanistan. And in fact, Afghanistan was about Taiwan. It was about to enable us to be stronger in the Pacific. I think we've, to some extent, succeeded. We don't really, you won't know until the history books are open. But it doesn't seem to me that the situation has gotten worse in the last year rather than better, despite of what the Chinese are doing militarily.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move on to Ukraine. Ivo, let's continue with you. It seems we're entering this new phase with Ukraine, and all intelligence estimates, whether it's Western allies, our own, certainly Ukrainian officials are, feel that Russia is prepared to launch an invasion, approximately 100,000 Russian troops on the border. And Russia is kind of saying, it's not ready to attack, but it wants some security guarantees. A NATO pledge will not expand eastward. NATO, a limit on kind of NATO training exercises. What are Putin's intentions here? And given, the tensions between the US and Russia, this is another area, just like China, where we really need to kind of lower the temperature and cooperate on a lot of things. But these kind of military confrontations make it really impossible.
So, as I said at the outset, I'm very worried. Not only is the intelligence clearly has spooked everyone in the administration, from hawks to doves on the Russia issue. 75% of the most advanced brigade equipment has been sent forward. It's not just in the West; it's also in the South. They build up in the Crimea and in the Black Sea, and it really worries them on the north. They're getting pretty darn close to Kiev if they wanted to invade, and they're postured clearly for an invasion. But that's just one signal. I think the worry is all the other signals. One of them is this diplomatic offensive of the last few days. When is the last time you have seen a diplomatic engagement which starts with one party publishing openly the very opening proposals, which it says it wants to compromise on, before there's even been a conversation? In fact, at the same time that they delivered to a U.S. official, Karen Donfried, the assistant secretary, got the officials and they were immediately published. That's not serious when you come to negotiations, let alone what's in it, which is not serious in the main. There are one or two things that we could talk about. Then, as the New York Times had this morning, we are seeing real big changes in cyber behavior that suggest that they may well be preparing to launch this hybrid kind of attack. And then finally, there is the rhetoric of Putin, the rhetoric of most of the people around him, from the defense minister to the head of the general staff to the foreign minister, where military technical solutions, which is what Putin called it again today when he was speaking in front of the military officers, are threatened openly as a way to resolve what he thinks is the issue. And what's the issue? The issue isn't NATO. The issue is that Ukraine is independent, and he doesn't want an independent Ukraine. He wants a Ukraine that is either part of Russia or subservient to everyone else. And so I'm really worried that they have basically decided to take matters into their own hands and move militarily, and it's going to be extraordinarily hard to convince them otherwise.
Jump in here, Ian. How worried are you about a potential serious conflict with Moscow next year?
Yeah, I guess we're 2 for 2 on agreeing on topics so far. I'll try to find a place to mix that up. But, I will say that if you are Russian and watching state media, and that's where you get your information from, it's kind of like if you're watching Trump all the time and OANN that you actually believe the election was stolen. The actual Russians right now believe that war is coming, and that it has been instigated by the US and by NATO and by the Ukrainians. They really believe it. And, the Russian president is saying that the Ukrainians are committing genocide against ethnic Russians in the occupied territories. Now, this is patently false. But if you're saying that, I mean, you obviously have to defend those Russians. You could not, as the president of Russia, stand idly by while genocide is being committed against your fellow Russians. So I think he is setting up to take action, assuming that the Americans do not give him, some form of diplomatic victory, which I'm not expecting. But I don't think that action is invasion of Ukraine. And I don't know if Ivo does. Because invasion of Ukraine very clearly would lead to very significant economic consequences, would lead to military consequences in terms of forward deployments from NATO, and also would probably be deeply unpopular in Russia itself at least over the medium term. But having said that, the Americans and the Europeans have said nothing about what we would do if Russia were to, for example, formally annex and protect the Russians on the ground who are being committed genocide against, and then take a buffer territory to ensure that the Ukrainians couldn't do that anymore. That would be seen as a win. How would the Germans respond to that? How would the French respond to that? I don't think we have an answer. And I deeply am worried. And by the way, if that were to happen and we don't respond well, this is a massive, massive domestic loss for Biden. And that the Republicans and Trump will run all over. So, I mean, I really do worry that Putin right now seems to be in the driver's seat on this crisis, and I don't like that one bit.
Yeah, just to add, I mean, I think a full-on invasion and complete occupation of all of Ukraine is I think the least likely military scenario, even if a military scenario is the most likely future outcome, and it could be from as little as basically annexing, as you say, the Donbass region with some buffer zone. It could extend to that, to a land bridge to Crimea if they wanted to, and it could ultimately that buffer zone may go all the way to the Dnieper, and that's half the country, and they're pretty much positioned like that, and that would also mean that Kiev is going to be in an easy reach of artillery, all of which are just bad from a military perspective. And you're right. How we respond to that in terms of economic measures, in terms of military measures, short of, I think, as Biden has said, invading ourselves, is going to be absolutely critical for determining the future of European security, let alone Biden's political standing at home.
Okay.
Yeah, Ivo, I don't actually understand why it is that we haven't made a statement with the Europeans that say that Ukraine's territory is inviolable, and any further incursion, right, would lead to these steps. I mean, do you have a view on that?
No, but we have said that. So NATO said it, the EU has said it, and the G7 said it. We have said that there were that our support for Ukrainian independence and sovereignty remains unwavering.
Yes, but it's not. But
there will be severe costs. Yeah, go ahead, Liz.
Yeah, but I mean, okay, yes, there's Ukraine's territorial independence and sovereignty is, sacrosanct. But the idea that Ukraine was going to join NATO, that it was going to be joining the EU, that it was going to be like really kind of brought in to the European, to the Western fold, I think that's not, as kind of clear anymore. And maybe that's why, they're not, I think maybe there is a perception that at least maybe Russia's testing the premise that Ukraine isn't as important to the West as it, or at least to the United States as it once was.
It was never very likely of Ukraine entering into NATO or for the European Union. And if anything has increased the likelihood, it's what Putin has been doing. And everything he does makes it more likely that this will happen and makes it more difficult, frankly, for the political forces in Europe in particular, and to some extent the United States, to counter that. So I don't think that's where we're at. I think where the real question is how much are we willing to do in order to prevent this from happening? I mean, if you really wanted to deter something, a couple of divisions of NATO troops would do that. But we have actually ruled that out. And you can make an argument that ruling that out basically suggests that the interests of Russia are higher and more important than our interests. And that then leads to, okay, you threaten all these economic sanctions, but if you actually have to implement them, are you going to do that because they're going to cost? And that's where I think the policy starts to unravel, potentially, because threats work best as a deterrent measure, and in post-deterrent, you have to implement them.
But very brief question for me, just Ivo, on this, and then I'll shut up on this, which is, on balance right now, do you think that the Russians are likely to take military action of some form against Ukraine? That's the sense I'm getting.
Yes. On balance, my view is that the next sort of 10 weeks are really scary. Presumably, he wouldn't do anything while he's in Beijing for the Olympics. And so maybe you're talking about mid-February, but on the other hand, maybe he would.
If the Olympics happen, by the way, which is
if the Olympics happen, right.
Let's move on to Afghanistan. We've talked about, the failure of U.S. policy. We've talked about the shocking way it was ended. But now we're faced with the idea that this aid-reliant economy has been thrown into deep turmoil. The central bank reserves have been, held, frozen by the United States, IMF also blocking the money. So basic services, education, hospitals, electricity, all, kind of thrown into disarray. And, the UN is really warning that Afghanistan is on the brink of collapse. And clearly the Taliban is doing nothing to, further its international recognition. Where should the international community be on this, Ian? There was an interesting piece on 60 Minutes the other day, and the aid community is like, we need to feed the people. We need to help the economy. We need to prevent this country from collapsing, despite the fact of the problems with the Taliban.
Well, the UN is getting some money. The Gulf states are providing some support. The OIC just made an announcement. I think the worst case scenario for this winter will probably be held off. I also think that the position of the White House is that this is off the headlines and is fading and no longer going to be a big issue for them domestically. And I think that's right. I think it is a big issue still with American allies who felt like they were treated sort of with summarily indifference. And especially allies in the Middle East, for whom this matters a lot, and they didn't have a say in the policy review, in the execution of the withdrawal, and they were deeply upset about that. So I think there's knock-on effects for the United States in terms of foreign policy influence and leadership, but I don't think Biden really cares, and I think that Afghanistan is a third-order priority for most people when you're talking about digging into your pockets.
So, Ivo, obviously take it with a grain of salt because it's from the Taliban, but there is merit to the idea that, if there's not enough support for the Afghan people, you get this catastrophic scenario with, and clearly I think, Afghanistan may be headed towards a civil war anyway, but just general impoverishment of the population, famine, and the exact kind of haven for, ISIS or other terrorist groups to, start anew.
Well, I mean, here's the problem, of course. So you have over a 20-year period created an economy in a country that is 100%, virtually 100% dependent on foreign aid and foreign everything. And so once you pull that out, the country is going to have a problem. And we're seeing the consequences now. The answer isn't, so therefore, let's pour in more money and create, recreate the very dependency that is creating this problem. I think the answer is you deal with the most immediate symptomatic issues. You avoid starvation, you send enough money through the World Food Program and other UN programs and NGOs to try to make sure that the worst doesn't happen. But in the end, the Taliban won this war and they're now responsible for governing. And we all knew that they've been doing for 20 years is fighting, not governing. And they weren't particularly good at governing last time around. And it's a very sad situation for the people of Afghanistan, because it just means that someone else is going to try to take political control, and a civil war which didn't get started, remind you, by the United States and its intervention in 2001, but has really been going on since the mid 1970s. Will continue, and in the end, for all the people who say, "Well, see, therefore we should have stayed," my retort is, "Well, see, once you created a dependency, you're always gonna there will always be a point at which when you leave chaos happens, and probably we shouldn't have stayed there as long as we did." And I think Ian is basically right from a domestic political perspective. We've moved on from Afghanistan, and there are other places, unfortunately, where people are starving, including in Ethiopia, and we try to help as best as we can. The problem with Afghanistan is, we spent a lot of effort and time there, and it didn't leave the country better off in many ways.
Well, don't we owe just to play devil's advocate, I was going to point to, Ian is right. This is a very third level or even less priority now because it's off the headlines. But you started off the discussion by saying, we were there for 20 years, everything we did, we're really not leaving the country in better shape. In fact, leaving, obviously there have been a lot of gains made that won't be undone, but do we owe the Afghans a little more than, sorry, this new government took over, but, we won't let you starve?
Well, yes. And if you want to do it from a moral perspective, in part because what is happening in the country is to some extent related to what we did there. But no, because whatever it is that we'll try to do isn't going to address the fundamental problem, which is a governance problem, which we weren't able to address in 20 years of being there and pumping in as much money as we did. In fact, we made it worse by making it more corrupt as a society and in a whole variety of ways. So what I hope is that we actually start looking inward and saying, okay, how did this happen? Why did we make these mistakes? How many people were not telling the truth? Rather than a debate, which is what we've been having over the last 6 months, was Biden right to leave in the way that he did? No, what we really should have had, how can you have 20 years of investment and actually end up with a conflict where you lose? And we lost this war in a very fundamental way. When you oust a government and you leave at the end, that government is back, you lose. So how did that happen? And I hope that is one of the things that comes out of it. By the way, the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, has an independent committee looking at lessons learned. And it would be really good for the United States military and civilians to finally do some lessons learned when we lose a war, because it seems to me that we tend to do that quite often. And maybe it's time that we learn some lessons.
I think the Kurds probably have, sort of at least as good of a moral, sort of weight on the Americans in terms of helping them out after broken commitments than the Afghans do. I mean, if we're trying to make that kind of an argument, it doesn't get you very far these days. I also think that in terms of mistakes made, President Trump deserves more credit for his mistakes than Biden has been getting. The person who's holding the bag, of course, ends up getting a lot of attention. But I mean, the fact is that this would not have been as much of a disaster if they had not given everything to the Taliban for nothing in return, a deal that never should have been cut. When with the whole inviting them to Camp David and all the rest, and again, I generally appreciate the impulse to end 20 years of fighting at enormous human and economic cost. But there were so many own goals shot by Americans all the way through these 20 years. And those lessons, as Ivo suggested, need to be learned.
Let's move on to the Capitol insurrection and just general threats to global democracy. I mean, we could start with, this virtual summit for democracy over the president raising the, alarm of the rising tide of authoritarianism. And, a lot of people might argue that it's a little rich for the US, Ian, to be holding a democracy summit right now, given, what we saw on January 6th. But, that as a reflection of, the problems of democracy that we're having at home, anything from, what's going on with voter rights to, everything else that we've seen over the last few years. Clearly, President Trump, it kind of, came to a head after President Trump. But looking forward, how are we going to, kind of fortify our own democracy and continue to be that? Right now, I wouldn't say we're necessarily a model for the rest of the world.
No one outside the U.S. would say that the U.S. is a model of democracy. Only few Americans would say that we are a model of democracy, and they mostly need to be disabused of that because you can't fix it unless you're honest about it. Right. I mean, that's part of the challenge. There are many things in the world that the Americans should be leading, and we are, by the way. NATO is one such thing. The Quad is another such thing. Global financial response, for example, to COVID, or the SDRs, IMF, another such thing. Vaccine diplomacy. The United States presently is donating more vaccines to other countries than the rest of the world is combined. We are leading that. So the fact that America has a broken democracy right now does not mean that we can't lead anymore. It just means that we can't lead on democracy. And the idea that Biden was going to host a summit of democracy is it's kind of ludicrous on its face. I mean, there are democracies that are running very well right now. Canada, Japan, Germany, in the last few months, they've all had elections. They've gone very well. They're very legitimate. It's inconceivable that what happened in January 6th could have happened in any of those countries. And we've learned literally no lessons from January 6th. I mean, it's only gotten worse since then. I mean, if you actually look at numbers of Americans that believe the election was stolen, the numbers have gone up in the last year. They've gone up. And I fear that January 6th is going to become an annual celebration of sorts for half of the country, and for another half of the country, it's going to be a permanent stain. And we've never had a holiday that has been so fundamentally divisive. And Trump's just announced he's going to give a big speech, of course, on January 6th, and there's going to be a lot more of that. I'm worried about the events of the day going forward. We all know that Islamic fundamentalist terrorism is nowhere close to the danger of the United States and 9/11. That, for example, white supremacist and white nationalist terrorism and extremist violence represents. And I increasingly think that the 1/6 annual remembrance actually both reflects a much bigger issue for the United States and is much more dangerous for the US than 9/11 has become. It's not something I don't think I want to necessarily write about publicly yet because it's so raw. But I mean, among us friends here in Chicago, I think it's real. So yeah, I mean, I don't think we've learned any lessons from it, and I think it's an enormous challenge going forward.
Yeah, Ivo, I think Ian really kind of put his finger on it, and that leads me to one of the questions that we have from our audience. That, in fact, I have kind of wondered myself, and I don't think we're being too dramatic here. And when we say civil war, it doesn't have to be like the the original Civil War, but the question is, more and more people are talking about the U.S. being on the path to civil war. How might this be avoided? We really are at a point where the nation is so divided. Do you think that's a real possibility? And how do we come back from the brink?
Yeah, I think it's a real possibility. I think the situation in the country is as bad as any time since the Civil War. The polarization is not just extreme; it's two different realities. I mean, people are living in their own reality, and increasingly we're divided. Families, cities, neighborhoods, states are being divided in blue and red, and red lives in one reality and blue lives in another reality. Just take the issue of vaccines. It's not race, it's not class, it's not age, it's not even geography. It's red and blue that determines whether or not you get a vaccine or not. At least that's a much more a better predictor. So that's number one. Number two is our politics is fundamentally broken. So we can't get stuff done. And the only way we get it done is if one party can finagle enough muscle to push something through. But it's rare. COVID, to some extent, helped in bipartisan packages that were done in 2020. But again, in 2021, it's all been one party muscling them through, and we know how difficult and how raw and how hard that has been. It's just on you name the issue. It's very rare to have bipartisanship these days on anything, and let alone an idea that we need to work together and compromise. Third, and I think this is where Biden is really getting at. Is we have failed to demonstrate that we as a democracy can still deliver for the people. And I think we are in an ideological competition in that sense with the Chinese, for example, who say that their model is better. They're now calling it democracy too, but leave that aside for the moment. But they're basically saying we are better at delivering for the people, for our people, than you are, whether it's zero COVID, whether it's taking on some of the corporate the economic inequality and corporate mischief that is happening in their country as well as here. A variety of ways they're trying to demonstrate that they're better able to provide than democracy, and increasingly people are uniting behind that, to the point that you now, particularly among young people, have large numbers of people who think that violence and military rule may be preferable to democracy. That's how you get a society that is being torn apart. And I'm deeply worried about it because I don't see the political leadership, and I don't see the cultural leadership. I don't see the leadership writ large that can bring people back and unite them. Biden ran on that ticket, but he's one person, and given everything that's going on with the deep polarization, I just don't see it happen, and I don't see any leadership anywhere. I couldn't come up with people who can bring the country back from the brink, and boy, we're at the brink.
Yep. Ian, Ivo mentioned China's, kind of touting its own model. Let's talk about China's economic model, the acute financial difficulties at Everglade, drawing attention to China's long-term over-reliance on property and credit expansion to fuel growth. They have an energy crisis, a government crackdown on tech. How do we think China might rebalance its economy? And then what does that say for, the implications of a slowing Chinese economy on a global economy? I'm just going to turn my screen off for 1 second because I need to plug in my charger, but you'll know I'm here.
They have to focus more domestically. And let's keep in mind that for the last 50 years, China has been the factory of the world. They have had an extraordinary amount of low cost and efficient labor. And other countries around the world, other wealthy countries, were willing to move capital to produce goods there, even at the expense of gutting our own middle and working classes. So, China was really benefiting from these two massive structural tailwinds that allowed them to have unprecedented growth. That's what globalization was fundamentally driven by. Now, you look ahead now, and both of those things are structurally going away. Number one, their labor is much more expensive. There's not as much of it, and it's also not as necessary because of robotics and automation, 3D printing and deep learning and big data, all this stuff. And furthermore, other countries around the world are no longer politically aligned towards moving more of the labor that they have to China. They actually want to focus more domestically, closer to consumers, benefit from protectionism, benefit from subsidy. So I think that structurally, China is in a much, much different position going forward, much more challenged. I think the reason why they are focusing on dual circulation policy, as they call it, which is focused on Chinese supply chain, Chinese consumption, and they're focused on common prosperity, Xi Jinping's sort of new concept of how he wants to be seen for his third term, is precisely because they understand they need this inward focus in that environment. They need to be investing in their own country. It's also one of the reasons why Belt and Road is getting 10% of the Chinese investment that it was 8 years ago. 8 years ago, everyone talked about Belt and Road as the new Chinese Marshall Plan. Today, China's not doing that go-out strategy with the kind of force that they were historically. So I think that as much as the Americans have deep, deep challenges in our political system, Chinese have deep structural challenges in their economic system. And if you ask me which I would prefer to bet on, of course, I'd prefer to bet on the US. Not because the US is going to be a functional democracy in 10 years, but when you bet, you're largely making economic bets.
Well, let's stay on the economy. Ivo, we're experiencing the highest inflation in 40 years, consumer price index about 6.8% higher than it was a year ago. And we have this kind of huge prices and increases in, particularly in gas and food prices. And some analysts are saying that inflation might spread more widely. It might last a little longer. And, we have a couple of things going on. We have supply chains. We have the great resignation, as people are saying, the apparentless, rethinking of a lot of Americans, that were sidelined by the pandemic, kind of not returning to work. 4 million fewer Americans working than there were, on the eve of the pandemic. So labor markets are tight, all of this going on. The Fed is already kind of moving to tighten monetary policy. What can we expect in the year ahead? And how does that impact the global economy?
So I'm no economist, and there's a big debate between economists on this issue of how lasting the inflation, how transitory it is. Certainly less transitory than a few months, that we already know. But whether we're talking a few years or more than that is still something that is being discussed. But I would say two things. One, I listen to what the central bankers are saying, and particularly our central bank, and I think they have their eye on the ball. They may have come a little late in terms of responding to inflation, but they're now moving collectively to start increasing interest rates in 2022, which is one way you deal with inflationary pressure. The second thing I would say is I think one of the things that the pandemic has taught us, or at least should have taught us, is that there's a whole group of people who are living at the margins of society. And they have been able to get by in our economy with 2 or 3 jobs, sometimes 3 or 4 or 5 jobs in a family, in order to have enough food on the table, in order to provide for medicine for an elderly, and to pay the rent. With a federal minimum wage that's still stuck at $7.25. I think one of the things the pandemic has done is it's mobilized particularly cash labor and sort of non-college educated labor to say enough. I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm not going to wash dishes at night and wait tables in the morning, go to be a barista at Starbucks in the morning and wait tables during the afternoon and work 18, 19, 20 hours. So I can keep food on the table. This is a society that should do better than that. And I think part of the pressure here is a reset, and a good reset. I mean, for God's sake, a dishwasher should at least make enough that if they work for 40 hours a week, that they can take care, particularly in a dual income household to take care and have a normal life. And that's also leading to inflationary pressure. And that kind of pressure, maybe the inflation is bad, but the pressure in and of itself is not that terrible. Remember people saying when the $300 extra check that these guys and gals were getting for unemployment and how horrible it was and was a disincentive for work. My argument is, look how little, if people are not working because they're getting $300 more a week, that's $15,000.
How little are they making?
How little were they making in the first place? Exactly. And that debate, I think, has now come to the fore in the last couple of years. And that's just as important for the health of our economy, ultimately, as figuring out the underlying inflationary pressure that the markets are going to do. Final point, when when the billionaires have made $1.8 trillion in the last economy, when Elon Musk can sell enough stocks so he pays $11 billion in taxes, I think thinking through where our economy and our society is going may be just as important as figuring out where inflationary pressures are.
Ian, I have one of the questions here. I want to branch it out a bit about, how are we going to adjust to the new COVID variants? I think we all thought we might be in a kind of post-COVID era by now. Obviously it wasn't back to, what things looked like before 2020, but a new, a reimagined kind of post-COVID era, but it seems we're not there yet. So how does everyone adjust to what seems to be kind of a new normal, at least, for now, given the fact that even countries with high vaccination rates like Denmark are still having surges in COVID cases. We're facing a lot of that here. Obviously, we have a lot of unvaccinated, but there doesn't seem to be a post-COVID era anytime soon.
Well, the question is, who's we? My mom would ask if you had a rat in your pocket, right? It was the South Africans. I was talking to Ramaphosa's chief economic advisor yesterday, South Africa, who was telling me, don't believe the numbers, the case numbers that we're showing you. We're not actually doing contact tracing. We know we're not really getting enough vaccines. And by the way, 90% of the country's already gotten COVID. So we've got a level of herd immunity and we're just living with it. Our hospitals aren't overwhelmed. The average age of the country is like 29, whatever. And so, they're through it. They're through it. And the funny thing is that we are still closing our country's borders to non-Americans coming from South Africa, which is kind of extraordinary. If Trump was doing that at this point, we would be saying it was a function of racism. And it's not. It's just stupidity and American exceptionalism and the desire that we have to do something, even if it's useless or actively hurtful, but it's not hurting Americans. So who cares?
Right.
But the reality is that this is annoying. We should stop. The Americans and the Europeans, of course, problem we have in the United States is not only have we not handled this well, but we've also politicized it massively. So, the single biggest factor that will determine whether or not you are vaccinated right now is not your race, it's not your gender, it's not your religion, it's not your age. It should be your age, right? Because old people will die if they don't get vaccinated. It's actually your political affiliation. It's astonishing. That's the single thing that most determines whether you are unvaccinated at this point is your political affiliation.
And such a point of privilege, right? Because in low income countries, there's like this, what people are calling vaccine apartheid, where, this is the new definition of poverty if you can't get a vaccine. And here in the United States, it's more about what your political beliefs are.
5 of the 8 African countries, South African countries that have faced cutoff from the United States have had to reject donations of vaccines because they could not get the vaccine in the arms fast enough. They were going to expire. COVAX was only talking about donations. They didn't do anything on the ground in terms of effective distribution. We are failing. Globally, we're failing. And the reason we have Omicron is because of that. It's a very simple thing, but I do believe that when you have the issue is not that Omicron is much less dangerous than Delta. It could be the same level of danger, but if you have an enormous population that has already gotten COVID or that has been vaccinated or vaccinated twice and boosted, then the reality is you're just not going to experience the same level of personal risk as a consequence. So our policies have to reflect that. They have to. And I think Biden is doing a horrible job in the last few weeks messaging on this. I mean, frankly, saying things like there's going to be death and hospitalization for everyone that isn't vaccinated. No, that's not true. There's going to be actually
it's also not productive to get other people vaccinated.
No, but it's not true. It's literally irresponsible. Young people that are healthy that don't get vaccinated are going to they're going to get COVID and they're going to pass it on. But most of them will not get sick. Don't lie to them. And I mean, we have been really inconsistent in the messaging. There's been a lot of disinformation, and it's been made worse by the fact that the scientists are not being honest with people. And so I think there's so much blame to go around on this. And it means that 2022 is going to be screwed up for a lot of Americans, not just in terms of like lockdowns and whatnot, but also just in all of the economic and social dysfunction that comes from living through this for 3 years.
Okay, we're coming up on the end and we're going a lot longer, as you guys know, than we expected, but there's so much to talk about. So I want to ask one more serious question to both of the panelists, and then I want to end on a positive note about some good things that we could possibly look.
Okay, gotta be tight.
Okay, let's just end on something good to look forward to in the next year. What's a positive development, Ivo?
So just to take off where Ian is, I think we're in a switch and I hope we're in a switch on COVID. I'm very, the fact that we now have treatments means that the idea of living with COVID may be something that we can actually get to and make that switch, that a combination of really good vaccines, which we still have. You need a booster in order for it to work really well. And we may need another booster, but the mRNA vaccines are really good. Plus the viral drugs that are about to be approved. Plus, and this is the key, frequent testing, so that you can, before you enter a big in-person, everybody gets tested. You can just reduce the chances of bad outcomes for lots and lots and lots and lots of people. If you then add to that a flexibility to in workplaces in terms of working from home or not from home, in order to allow people to do what allows them to be safe, I think we can figure out a way to do this. But we do need to have a government that has a strategy to help us getting there to that point. And so far we haven't figured it out. But my hope is that 2022, I think we now know enough about the data, with the one unknown, is there another variant who not only could evade to infect people, but actually got much, much worse in terms of its outcomes. We haven't seen that yet, but that's the one big unknown. But for the rest, I think we now know how to do it. The only question is, will we do it?
Okay, Ian, this is one last question, and you can't agree with Ivo on this. Reason to be hopeful for next year.
I think that we are finally on a track to ending fossil fuels globally. I wouldn't have said that even 3 years ago. I'm not sure I would have said at the beginning of this year, but I think we are. I think in the next generation, a majority of the world's energy will no longer come from oil, coal, and gas. And that is an astonishing testament happening in spite of the fact that the US is politically so dysfunctional and divided, in spite of the fact the Americans and Chinese basically aren't coordinating, we're still doing it. And that's human ingenuity, it's pressure, and it's a new generation. So I am getting more optimistic about one of the biggest problems that faces us.
Well, this was a really rich discussion, and we'll be picking it up in the new year. You can always watch World Review on Fridays with Ivo. And that wraps up our lessons learned for 2021. Hopefully it offers some lessons for policymakers. Thank you so much to everyone that turned in, and to Ian and Ivo. And as a reminder, a recording of this conversation will be available for playback on the council's social channels and website shortly. Thank you, everybody, and happy holidays.
Happy holidays. Good to see you.
Too.
Take care. Thanks.